Hello everyone. In this presentation, Predestination Part Two, we'll look at the predestination of a central person and also clarification of biblical passages that seem to support absolute predestination. What is the truth about that? And also the human portion of responsibility in relation to God's portion of responsibility. So first of all, we look at the predestination. The one thing that's absolutely predestined is God's will. As we get from the biblical passage, I've spoken, I will bring it to pass, I've purposed, and I will do it. So God's will is predestined as absolute, but the accomplishment of that is determined by the fulfillment of the human portion of responsibility. For example, God called, or He predestined Adam. But Adam didn't fulfill God's will at that time. But God's will never changed. God's will remained with him. Therefore, He called Jesus as the second Adam. Jesus came as Messiah. He came to fulfill God's will on the earth. But He was crucified, He was killed, and He promised to come again at the second coming of Christ. So God's will finally be realized at that time, because nothing can change God's will. And there's many examples of this in the Bible. We can see God called Moses to lead the people into the blessed land of Canaan. When Moses couldn't fulfill it, then Joshua succeeded in that. Also, of the 12 disciples, Judas Iscariot betrayed Jesus. Then God called Matthias. Matthias was called to fulfill the number 12 at that time. So it's very important, really, to understand, in order to understand predestination, God's portion of responsibility. God has created us in such a way that He allows us to fulfill a portion of responsibility, because God created us to live in freedom. God created us to live in love. But love is only possible when we have freedom. So therefore God does everything. God created the whole world. This is all God's work. But God only asks us to fulfill a small part. We call this 5%. Of course it means 100% effort on our part. But this part is so small in comparison to all of God's work. But only when we fulfill that portion of responsibility is God's will accomplished. And then we inherit all of God's blessing from that. So this is a very important principle. So nothing is predestined absolutely by God. So look now at clarification of biblical passages that we looked at the beginning of the previous presentation. First of all, Romans 8:30. For those whom He predestined, He also called. And those whom He called, He also justified. And those whom He justified, He also glorified. When we see this passage, it looks like everything is completely predestined by God. The foreknowledge of God, God's predestination, the calling, and then the justification and glorification of a person. But this is only because in the passage it doesn't mention the human portion of responsibility, which comes between being called and justified and glorified. No one's automatically justified and glorified. There are many persons who are called through God's foreknowledge, predestined and called, such as Judas Iscariot. Through God's foreknowledge, he was obviously predestined and called to be a disciple of Jesus. But when he betrayed Jesus, he failed in his responsibility, so he was not justified or glorified. King Solomon, likewise, was called through God's foreknowledge and predestined and called, but he was not justified and glorified. He committed many sins. And there's many examples of this in the Bible. Romans 9:21. Has the potter no right over the clay to make out of the same lump one vessel for honourable use and another for dishonourable use. So this seems, again, to emphasize God's as a favoritism. He chooses some people for glory and others just to be used. But the meaning of this is really to show that people have no right to complain to God about the way God saves them. God knows how to save humanity. This is from Paul, the Apostle Paul, by the way, and people were not happy about the new realm, salvation through Jesus and so on. But Paul was saying you have no right. He meant by this you have no right to complain how God is saving you. It's similar to if you're having an operation. In an operation you have a specialist working under surgery on you. But does it make sense that you complain how he's doing it? It only makes sense if you are a surgeon yourself. Otherwise, it's better to trust the surgeon who knows how to perform an operation that will save you. Now, this is similar to the other passage that God said he'll have mercy on whom he has mercy and compassion on whom he has compassion. It's a similar thing. God works in a way to save all humanity because God loves everyone. And only God knows how to do this. So trusting God and working through and follow the central person of the age is always crucially important. People who failed in this, they never accepted the central person. Many people fell away from following Moses, didn't follow Jesus, and it goes on throughout history. God always works through the central person of the age. Now, many people look at the two prophecies of the coming of Jesus, the suffering prophecy of Isaiah 53, he'll suffer and die, but also the prophecy that he'll come as King of Kings. Now the reason why is dual prophecies, because of human portion of responsibility, that God cannot interfere in that. God has given us free will. So whether Jesus would suffer and die, whether he'd be glorified, it was determined by people in response to him. If the people of Israel at that time totally united with Jesus and followed him, then he'd become King of Kings in Israel at that time. But unfortunately, not doing that, they would suffer and die, and then Israel as a nation, they would suffer the consequences for that, as Jesus predicted. So God's will is always determined by the fulfillment of the human portion of responsibility, which is 5%. So it's really unfortunate that persons like John Calvin, who propounded the theory of absolute predestination, is believed by many people. But this really is in ignorance of human portion of responsibility. He only seems to have understood that everything is predestined by God as 100%. But this has caused people to think that their plights in life, their suffering, is all part of God's plan, which is untrue. So anyway, thank you for this, hearing this presentation. It's so important we have a clear understanding of God's plan in our lives. We're all part of God's plan. God loves all of us, but we need a portion of responsibility, which is crucial to respond to God, to follow God in our lives, have our own personal relationship with God. So in the next presentation, we'll look at Christology. Christology is the nature of Christ. Who is Christ? Who is Jesus Christ? And this is very important to understand Jesus. Also about the second coming of Christ. In what form, how would the second coming take place? So thank you for hearing this presentation. And I'll see you in the next presentation, Christology. Thank you very much.